Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. And as we've often started a number of episodes, you'll hear me start this one the same way. Today we want to do a little bit something different here on A Fork in Time. And that something today is actually a very intentionally designed feedback loop to come from our listeners back to A Fork in Time. One of the things that Alexis and I have noticed, as well as I think some of our guest hosts and guest contributors as well, is that we tend to find now about 75 to 80 episodes into doing an alternate history podcast, is there definitely appears to be a set of recurring themes. And of course, we've all heard the old adage about history is doomed to repeat itself for those that don't study it, or doomed to repeat it. And it's certainly true that there seems to be common themes throughout history, because history does center around, a set of common themes related to power and the rise and fall of empires and people groups. There's no doubt that there's those types of recurring themes that exist throughout history. But one of the things that I wanted to explore, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after the break here in a moment, is trying to understand whether this is something that is unique to the way that Alexis and I and our guest contributors approach alternate history, or whether this is something that is actually ingrained in alternate history itself. So when we come back, I'm going to give a brief explanation of what we're seeking from our listener base, and we're using this episode to launch that off, particularly without focusing on any other topic. And so when we come back from this break from some of the folks that help make the show possible, explain a little bit more about what we're asking you as a listener to do and why we think it's of value. Be back in a minute. Alexis and Don taking just a quick break from the podcast here to let you know about one of the organizations that helps support the podcast, makes it possible, and that's Instacart. So in these days, Alexis, how much do you enjoy going to the store?
Not a lot.
Not a lot. So would it be nice if somebody went to the store with or for you?
That'd be great.
Yeah. So you can take advantage of the link in the show notes and get introduced to Instacart. Instacart will do that for you. They'll go do your shopping for you. They will get the items that you request. They'll even pick out things like produce, do all those things. Make it easy for you to shop now in this socially distanced, challenging world. They were a service before this, and I think they're even more valuable service now. And if you'll check out the link in the show notes, there'll be a special offer there. Normally it's around getting your first delivery for free, so you have a chance to check them out for no additional charge. So Alexis, what would you suggest that our listeners do?
Definitely go check out that link. And I do want to say a couple things about Instacart. You can do multiple stores on one order, and you can also, you mentioned produce, you can get real specific with that produce. You can say, make sure you get me really green bananas. And the person who does your shopping will get you really green bananas. So it's really customizable. So definitely go check out that link for Instacart in the show notes.
Good. And of course, we get some credit for that, and we get some benefit, and you get the value of the service. So we think it's a win-win. So we invite you to check out, via the show note links, Instacart. Welcome back to A Fork in Time. Hope that you stuck with us through the break and that the introduction didn't scare you off into thinking this is not an episode that I want to continue with. Because as we've talked about so many times here on the podcast, our goal is to create a community of folks that are interested in alternative history and the way that it can instruct regular history. And so Alexis and I have certainly discovered that as we've been doing the podcast now for a while, I guess we're in the upper 70s in terms of episodes, that we find ourselves coming back to very often. It feels like that we're talking about the same thing, because while we've launched off into a particular event from a different fork, from a different change in terms of the actual history, we find ourselves realizing that change leads to a change in what I would call a big event in history. I'll define that a little bit more verbally here in a minute. And that once you change the big event, sort of multiple roads lead to the same, if you will, to the same freeway or to the same highway. You may take a different tributary or a different on-ramp to get there, but once you're headed down that particular branch of the alternate history, there's a lot of commonality, and it gets tougher to distinguish more detail moving forward. So a good example of that might be, because we often visit there, and the timeline and the time frame of this often leads us to this, is imagining, for example, if there had been a different English Reformation. We've come into that by having a different outcome with Henry in terms of Henry VIII, in terms of being able to have a male heir, and thus not the need to seek a divorce from his first wife Catherine over that issue, and where you actually have a different flavor of the English Reformation. And so if England remains Catholic, for example, and there's a number of different ways that you might keep England Catholic that either relate to that particular event with Henry VIII or related to other things that are around that particular period of time, we seem to come back to then sort of the same conclusions that draw, despite the fact that we've launched off from different starting points. Another example, again, keeping in that sort of general genre there, is the idea of the Reformation in general in Europe. If there had been not the separation of Protestant denominations and the Protestant elements of the Christian faith away from the Catholic Church, how might have things been different with either a Reformed Catholic Church or a reconciliation that would have led to still a more universal view of Christendom that was still contained in the Catholic Church that existed pre-Reformation, or even more importantly, maybe pre the split between the Eastern and Western branches of the Church. Very often we've come at that from different angles, again, different starting points, but find ourselves leading to the same conclusions where if you change something that leads to changing the Reformation, those concepts tend to merge together as you move forward in time. Similar types of things obviously are like things like the American Civil War and changing its outcome, the things that can go from changing the outcome or the timing of the world wars, the 20th century, World War I, World War II. Certainly if you go back further in time, talking about ancient Greece, talking about the Greek conquests under Alexander the Great, talking about the nature of the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire, the timing of that. All of these tend to be sort of larger themes, but I'll just use the term here, big events, to describe them, that while you may have literally hundreds or thousands of different entree points into talking about that event, once you change some major event that relates to that, a lot of the outcomes seem to be the same. And so our question is that just something about the way that I think about history or that Alexis thinks about history? Or is that something that is actually a broader theme that you as an audience, as a listener group, would agree with? And the best way we know to accomplish that is to actually put out a survey. Now, again, we already know the challenge of being a podcast, being a traditionally one-way audio medium, and that we don't have everybody who can either find the time, take the time, or is willing to take the time to come back and complete a survey for us. But by making this its own special episode, we are really putting an emphasis on getting this type of feedback from you. And so you will see in the show notes a link directly to a very, very brief SurveyMonkey questionnaire that I've created, a survey that's designed to get feedback on this. And the whole point is really understanding a couple of broad areas of that tie back to this question that I'm raising and getting feedback from our listeners that we really want to know. The first of those, is it actually true that there are very easily identifiable big events in history that are noticeably more significant in terms of their impact or the way that you construct alternate history timelines? I've already given a number of examples already, so I won't go back through that list. But for example, is it definitely the case that if you change the American Civil War or the American Revolution, just to focus on American history only, that if you make that change, that is obviously an identifiable, easily picked out big event in history, and almost anyone who's looking at the idea of alternate history would agree with that? Or is it the case that we have oversimplified that and not realizing that in many instances, yes, you would have made a change there, but things might not have been as different? So we'd like your feedback on that particular question, which we put in terms of a spectrum part on the survey there, which is about how easy is it to identify the big events. Following up with that, we'd like for you to actually give us feedback on what you believe are the top 5 quote-unquote big events in history. I think that we'll find a lot of overlap there, that we will have a lot of commonality to it, but I also firmly believe with the diversity of our listening audience, we're going to discover that there is disagreement on what some of those big events are. And then I'd like to come back when we share the results of this, and we'll have a separate show where we share the survey results to talk about those and what we found there that's unique or different or that's interesting. So if you could do that and help us identify what you believe are the top 5 quote-unquote big events, major theme events, if you will, in history that when you go down an alternative path have the most impact. And again, that also ties back to how easily identifiable they are. The last thing actually is looking for those sort of hidden big events. There specifically, they may be something that you listed on your top 5, but which event might be one of those things that sort of obscures itself or hides itself from being readily apparent? Are there big events that we sort of forget about as being big events, either because they're just so obvious and ingrained in the flow of history that we overlook them, or that they are so obscure but yet so important that they're easily lost? I'd be very interested to know from this educated audience that I know we have for A Fork in Time what those might be, because those would be some excellent areas for us to focus future episodes on. That's part of the reason for doing that. This is also an inadvertent way of getting, obviously, topical themes moving forward, but also making sure that we avoid some of the same topical themes, not because we didn't launch from a different fork in time, but because they're so related to that common thing that they end up merging. I'll use my analogy again. They end up merging into the same roadway, regardless of which tributary that you manage to go down. And so we're really, really encouraging our listeners, if you would, to take just 5-10 minutes. Really would appreciate it to go and fill out the survey. We'll allow about a month before we'll compile back the results, but I'm very curious to see what's there. So how do you go and fill out the survey? The easiest way probably is to actually launch from the link that will be in the show notes. So you can just go there and click, and you'll be connected to it. It will certainly be prominent on our website. That's www.aforkintimepodcast.com. So you can go there and you'll easily find the link that's there. If you do go to the web, whichever way you might get there to our website, to A Fork in Time's website, we would encourage you to complete some of the other surveys that are there. Our general listener survey, there's all the other mechanisms that we talk about, the feedback forms, etc., where we want the feedback there. It's a good time if you're doing the one survey for us here, you can do others as well. And of course, as Alexis would remind me if she were sitting here for this podcast episode, how much we still appreciate and enjoy the COVID check-in for those that check in with us from time to time. So again, today's episode is not going to be discussing a particular fork in time, but it's more of a plea to our valued regular listeners to give us some particular feedback that plays into what we do here at A Fork in Time, for us to better analyze and understand what you think about history's major themes, how they play with alternate history, and how we should approach that here from the show. So again, I appreciate you giving us a little bit of time today, and just give us a little bit more time on the side to go and do that, and we certainly would appreciate it. So this is Don signing off for today's episode of A Fork in Time, and look forward to our next episode where we'll go back to our normal process of looking at a particular moment in history and that historical what if. So next time we will encounter A Fork in Time, and we'll take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.